Mom kicked me out for being selfish. She begged to move in when her life fell apart. When I was 17, my life was turned upside down in one night. I sat in my room in our house in a small town in Texas, counting the money I'd been saving for 2 years working after school at the local diner. It was my blood money, $3,000 for college, for the dream of getting out of this dusty hole where everyone knew each other by name. I was putting the bills in an old tin cookie box when my mom burst in on me like a hurricane. Her face was red, her eyes glittered with anger, and her voice shook like she was about to explode. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides, looking at me as if I were an enemy of the people. I didn't know then that it would be my last night at home. She started shouting from the doorstep. She said I was an ungrateful, selfish girl who thought only of herself. I sat there, dumbfounded, trying to figure out what was going on. It turned out that my little brother, Anthony, that damn golden boy who always got away with everything, had wrecked his old car, the one my mother had bought him for his 16th birthday, even though he hadn't even graduated high school. He'd crashed into someone's fence, gotten drunk with his buddies, and now he needed a new pickup truck. And my mom decided my money was the perfect solution. I still remember her standing over me, pointing her finger at my box. She yelled that I had an obligation to help the family, that Anthony was our future, that he was the man of the house, and needed more than I did. I tried to object, said it was my money, that I was saving it for school, that this was my chance to get out. But she wouldn't even listen. Her voice became louder, sharper. She called me a selfish woman who spits on her family. I felt my insides tighten like someone was pulling the air out of me. And then she gave me an ultimatum. Either I give her the money or I leave the house. I sat there looking at her, and I couldn't believe it was my mother. The woman who taught me to read, made me soup when I was sick, now looked at me like I was trash. Anthony stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, and remained silent. The creep didn't even look up, didn't even say a word in my defense. He was 16, a year younger than me, but he'd always been king to Mom. His laziness, his drinking, his perpetual joints all forgiven because he was her boy. And me, I was just a shadow, someone who had to keep quiet and obey. I stood up, clenched my fists, and said I wouldn't give the money back. It was my ticket to life, my hope, and I wasn't going to give it up for his stupid pickup truck. My mom freaked out. She yelled at me to pack my things and get out of her house since I was so ungrateful. I stood there, feeling the ground go from under my feet. It was my house, the place where I'd grown up, where every crack in the wall was familiar. But in that moment it had become foreign. I packed my bag, a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, that box of money, and left. She slammed the door behind me so that the glass shook, and I was left on the porch alone in the darkness of the Texas night. That night I slept over at a friend's house, Casey, who lived 3 streets over. Lying on her couch, staring up at the ceiling and trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. Why did my mother choose him? Why had I, who had studied for straight A's, worked through the night to help with the bills, turned out to be selfish? I remembered how she praised Anthony for every little thing. For scoring a goal on the school team, even though he missed half the games, for being so brave when he got drunk with his buddies. And me, I brought home awards, helped with dinner, babysat him when he was little, but it meant nothing to her. From that day on, I swore to myself that I would never depend on her again. I was 17, scared as hell, but there was an anger burning inside that pushed me forward. I left that town a year later, went to college thanks to a scholarship and the money I hadn't given away. I worked like hell to pay my rent, studied nights while others hung out. I built my life from the ground up, and every time I wanted to give up, I remembered her words. "You're selfish, Emily." It was like fuel. I was proving to her, to myself, to the world that I could do it. Without her, I didn't just survive. I took my life in my hands and built something my mom couldn't even dream of. A year later, I left that dusty little town, went to college in Austin with a partial scholarship and the money I hadn't given Anthony. I worked as a waitress, then got a job as an assistant at a design firm, studying at night while the other students hung out. I didn't sleep, I didn't eat right, but I knew this was my chance. I graduated from college with honors, got a degree in marketing, and started climbing the career ladder. First small projects, then big clients. By 25, I was running campaigns for big brands, and by 34, I was a partner at an agency in Austin. Now I have my own house, not some barn but a stylish bungalow overlooking the hills, a car, a bank account that grows every year. I'm successful, for crying out loud, and I've made it on my own. But even with that success, I couldn't erase her voice from my mind. You're selfish, Emily. Those words buzzed through me like a swarm of bees every time I remembered how she'd put Anthony above everything else. He was her king, her pride, even though he didn't deserve it one bit. I remember when she bought him that first pickup truck for his 16th birthday. He hadn't even graduated high school, and she glowed like he'd won a Nobel Prize. 3 months later, he crashed it after getting drunk with his buddies, and she just shrugged. Boys are boys. Meanwhile, I was working at the diner to pay for my books, and she never once said, "Good job." I brought home straight A's, cooked dinner, babysat him when he was little, but it was nothing to her. Anthony could lay on the couch, skip classes, have parties, and she still looked up to him as a star. I tried to figure out why she loved him so much. Maybe because he was a boy. Because he knew how to suck up to her, tell her she was the best mom in the world. I was never like that. I was direct, I spoke my mind, and it pissed her off. I remember her yelling at me for spilling juice on the carpet when I was 12 and Anthony broke a window with a ball, and she just laughed. Well, he's growing up. I helped with the household, I studied, I worked. But in her eyes I was always second. It was killing me inside, but I didn't show it. I wore that pain like an old jacket, heavy but familiar. And every time I achieved something, a new position, a contract, a house, I thought, here you go, Mom, see what I'm worth. Now I'm 34. I'm a partner in a marketing agency, running campaigns for companies she's never even heard of. I have a team, clients all over the state, a reputation I built from the ground up. I drive a shiny black Jeep, live in a house with huge windows, and drink coffee on the patio looking out over the rolling hills of Austin. My life isn't just a success, it's a victory over everything it has forced upon me. I haven't just survived, I've soared. People in the office call me Iron Emily because I don't give up, I don't break down, I take what's mine. But even with that, there's still that 17-year-old girl inside me who stood on the porch feeling the door slam behind her. I didn't call her, didn't text her, didn't ask about Anthony. They were in the past, in that town, where I'd left my tears and anger. I thought I'd cut them off from my life forever. But that splinter, her love for him, her blindness to me, wouldn't go away. I remembered how she bought him new sneakers when he failed exams, and I had to wear tattered shoes because, you can do it, Emily. How she bragged about his charm to the neighbors while I stayed home helping her with the cooking. He was her sunshine, and I was just a shadow she didn't notice. I built my life to forget that. Every contract, every paycheck, every new client was proof to me that I wasn't the selfish person she called me. I had become someone she could never have imagined me to be: strong, independent, someone who didn't need her approval. My friends would say, "Emily, you're like something out of a movie, rising from nothing." And I laughed, but inside I knew it wasn't a movie, it was war. I was at war with her words, with her choices, with her blindness. And I won. My home, my career, my life, it was all mine, and no one could take it away. But even with that success, I couldn't get her out of my mind. Why did she love him so much? Why was I nothing to her? I asked myself these questions over and over again, but there were no answers. I thought it was in the past, that I had let go of that pain, but it sat inside me like an old scar that aches before the rain. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her voice. I'd cut them off, her, Anthony, that whole town, like a piece of rotten rope. But somewhere inside, I knew it wasn't over. Something told me she'd come back, and I'd be faced with the choice I'd feared all my life. And then, a few weeks ago, she showed up, knocked on my door, hunched over, bag in hand, eyes full of tears. She said she had nowhere to go, that Anthony had abandoned her, that she had lost everything. She stood there begging to stay with me, as if she'd forgotten how she'd kicked me out 17 years ago. I looked at her, and everything inside of me turned upside down. I'd achieved everything: success, a home, freedom, but here she was, the mother who'd chosen him, standing on my doorstep asking for help. And I didn't know what to do. Why hadn't she seen my efforts my whole life? Why do I still feel that prick in my chest when I look at her? I froze, feeling old wounds opening, as if someone was tearing open the stitches I'd spent years trying to mend. I didn't know what to say. A storm was raging inside me: anger, pain, shock. This woman, who had chosen Anthony over me, who had kicked me out at 17, was now standing on my doorstep asking for help. I looked at her and saw not just an aged mom, but the one who had made me invisible. She looked pathetic, her hair gray, her face wrinkled, her clothes crumpled, as if she hadn't washed them in weeks. But I didn't feel pity. Not right away. I could feel the old anger rising from the depths, as if all those years of success couldn't drown it out. She began to tell her story as I stood, arms crossed, and listened. She said that after I left, she invested everything in Anthony. Bought him that pickup truck, then another one when he wrecked the first one. Gave him money for his business. Some stupid plan to open an auto repair shop with his buddies that fell apart after 6 months. She worked overtime at the supermarket, took out loans so he could get back on his feet. And him? He took and took, until he sucked her dry. She said he disappeared a couple months ago, took the last of her savings and drove off, leaving her with debts and evicted from her home. Her voice was breaking as she added that he hadn't even called. I listened and everything was boiling inside me. She was talking about Anthony with this strange mixture of pride and despair, as if he was still her golden boy who had just lost his way. And I stood there thinking, really? You gave him everything you had and kicked me out. For $3,000? I wanted to scream, but I kept it together. My success, my career, my home, my life. All of it was proof that I wasn't the selfish person she said I was. I became a partner in a marketing agency, ran campaigns for brands, built a name for myself. And her. She bet everything on him, and he screwed her. But as she spoke, I noticed something else. Her hands were shaking, her voice breaking, not just from tears, but from weakness. She looked sick-skin gray, dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't eaten properly in months. She coughed, and the sound was dry, hoarse-like someone who hadn't been to the doctor in a long time. I felt a prick in my chest, not pity, but something else, something I didn't want to admit. This woman had ruined me 17 years ago, but now she stood before me broken, and I didn't know what to do about it. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't let her in right away. I couldn't. I needed time to digest this. She nodded, lowered her head, mumbled something about a motel nearby, and left, dragging her suitcase down the sidewalk. I closed the door and leaned back against it, feeling my heart pounding. My home, my fortress, my sanctuary, the place I'd built without her was now threatened. Not because she could take it away, but because her presence was opening the Pandora's box I'd kept closed for years. I didn't sleep that night, sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I remembered everything. How she praised Anthony for every little thing, how she bought him new sneakers while I walked around in tattered shoes. How she called him the future of the family, even though he was lying on the couch skipping school. And me, I was the one who cooked dinner, who brought in straight A's, who worked into the night to help with the bills. But to her, I was nothing. I remembered how she yelled at me for spilling juice and called his drinking youth. How she kicked me out because I wouldn't give her money for his stupid pickup truck. And now here she was, asking for help like nothing had happened. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. She'd given him everything, money, time, love, and he'd run away like a rat from a sinking ship. And I, whom she threw out, stood on my own 2 feet, made it on my own. And now she's come to me because she's got nothing left. It was almost funny if it wasn't so painful. She chose him, and he betrayed her. And I, the one she called selfish, was her last hope. I tried to figure out how I felt. Anger? Hell yeah, it was burning me up inside. Pity? Maybe a little, but I was pushing it down inside me. I didn't want to feel sorry for her. She didn't deserve it, not after she'd cut me out of her life. But there was something else there, a guilt I hadn't expected. Maybe I should have helped then, 17 years ago? Maybe if I'd given that money away, things would have been different? I shook those thoughts away, but they kept popping into my head like pesky flies. I knew it was nothing, it wasn't my fault. She'd made her choice and it was wrong. The next day she came back. She knocked on the door, standing there with the same bag, but now with a box in her hands, old photos, some papers. She said she didn't want to impose, but she had nowhere else to go. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid I'd slam the door shut again. I stood looking at her and felt everything turn over. Inside, my life, my career, my home, my freedom, it was all mine, and I didn't want to share it with her. But she looked so weak, so lost, that I couldn't just kick her out like she kicked me out. I told her I'd think about it for another day. She nodded and left, and I was left alone with this chaos in my head. Anger struggled with something I couldn't name. I had achieved everything without her: success, a name, a life she hadn't dreamed of. But here she was, standing in front of me, broken, asking for a piece of what I had built. And I didn't know what to do. Does she deserve a chance after all she's done? Or should I slam the door shut and leave her in the past forever? I sat staring at the empty cup and felt the old questions coming back. Why did she choose him? Why can't I still get over this pain? The third day after my mom showed up on my doorstep, I decided it was time to deal. She came every time with the same bag and box, standing at the door like a lost puppy, her trembling voice digging into my nerves. I couldn't listen to her. I have nowhere to go anymore without answers. Why was she here? What really happened to Anthony? And why does she think I should save her after everything? I told her to come in, not because I'd given up, but because I wanted the truth. She came in, put the box on the floor, sat down in a chair and started talking. But what I heard overturned everything I thought about our past. She told me how Anthony had left her. After I left at 17, she'd invested everything in him: money, time, hopes. A couple months ago, he took the last of her savings, almost $10,000, and took off. Didn't call, didn't write, just disappeared. She was left with debts, evicted from her home, penniless. Her voice shook when she said he was her mistake. But I could see that old spark in her eyes. She still loved him, even after everything. I sat there listening, and everything boiled up inside me. She'd given him everything, and he'd run away like a coward. But that wasn't the whole story. As she spoke, I noticed her fingers rubbing the edge of the box with her fingers. I asked what was in it, and she reluctantly opened it. Inside were old photos, letters, some papers. She pulled one out, a yellowed sheet written in her handwriting. It was a list of her sacrifices for Anthony. How much she'd spent, how many hours she'd worked. But then I saw something else. A note, dated a year after she kicked me out. Emily could help, but she's selfish. Anthony is my hope. My heart sank. She hadn't just chosen him then. She'd continued to believe that even afterward. I snatched up the sheet, feeling my hands shaking. This wasn't just a random fight. 17 years ago it was an entire philosophy. She'd written that I was too stubborn. That I didn't understand family. That I'd abandoned them. Abandon them? She kicked me out. I stared at those words, and something inside me clicked. All these years later, I thought it was a spontaneous decision, a flash of anger. But it wasn't. She had deliberately cut me out because I didn't fit into her plan to make Anthony a star. I asked her why she believed in him so much. She faltered, lowered her gaze, mumbled something about boys needing to be strong. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. You were too independent, Emily. You didn't need me, and he did. I almost choked. Really? She kicked me out because I was strong? Because I didn't ask for her help? Didn't fawn over her like Anthony did? I remembered how he knew how to suck up to her. Hugging her, telling her she was the best mom, even when he failed at everything he touched. And I was the direct, stubborn one, the one who told the truth to her face. And for that, I became selfish. But that wasn't all. I started going through the box myself while she sat with her head down. I found another piece of paper, a letter from Anthony written a couple years ago. Mom, give me more money. I'll pay you back, I promise. You know Emily will never help. I froze. He knew I'd left, knew she'd kicked me out, and still used me as an excuse. And she believed it. She was giving him money, thinking I was out there somewhere, living my selfish life, and didn't want to help. It was a lie they both supported. Him to coax more out of her to justify her choices. I sat looking at those papers and felt the anger shift into something cold and sharp. All these years I'd blamed myself. Maybe I'd been too harsh, maybe I could have stayed. But now I saw the truth. She hadn't just chosen him. She'd built a whole story where I was the bad guy. And he was the good guy. She'd lied to herself, lied to him, and those lies had destroyed her. Anthony wasn't her hope. He was a parasite that sucked her life dry and ran away when the food ran out. I looked at her. She sat hunched over, rubbing her fingers together, and was silent. Her pitiful appearance, gray skin, trembling hands didn't make me feel sorry for her. I wanted to scream, to ask how she could be so wrong, how she could believe in him after everything. But I held back. I asked only one thing. Did you know he was lying about me? She raised her eyes full of tears, and muttered, "I thought you could come back help, but you didn't." I almost laughed. Come back? After she threw me out into the middle of nowhere? It was so ridiculous I didn't know whether to be angry or laugh. She went on to say that Anthony promised her a great future, that he was her last chance. She clung to him because she was afraid of being alone. And me, I was the one who was managing on my own, and that scared her. She didn't want a strong daughter, she wanted someone who would need her, someone she could control. Anthony was perfect. Weak, dependent, deceitful. And I was too independent, too selfish to fit into her picture. After I learned the truth from Mom's papers and her words, I couldn't sleep. I sat up half the night, staring into the darkness, clutching a cold cup of coffee while my mind spun chaos. She kicked me out at 17, called me selfish because I didn't give my money to Anthony. She'd chosen him, poured everything into him, love, time, savings, and he'd run away, leaving her with debt and empty hands. And now she was standing on my doorstep, begging to stay with me, as if I owed her something. 17 years I'd built a life without her, made partner at an agency, bought a house in Austin, created a name I was proud of. And here she is, broken, asking for a piece of what I chewed out on my own. I had to decide what to do with her, but it wasn't just a choice between yes and no. It was a choice between the past and who I had become. She came back this morning, knocked on the door, standing there with the same bag and box, eyes red like she hadn't slept. I let her in, but not to talk. I already knew what I was going to say. She sat down, hunched over, and began again. "Emily, I have nowhere to go. I can't do this alone." Her voice shook, and I could see her trying to squeeze pity out of me. But I didn't feel it. Not after finding those notes where she called me selfish even a year after she kicked me out. Not after finding out that she believed Anthony's lies while he swindled money out of her. I sat there looking at her and felt everything boiling inside, but I kept my cool. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let it go. I told her I couldn't let her live with me. My home was my sanctuary, my victory, the place I'd built without her. I didn't want her shadow to fall on my life again. She lowered her head, tears rolling down her cheeks, but I didn't flinch. I'd fought too long to become who I was, the successful, independent, ironclad Emily, as my coworkers call me. But I didn't slam the door shut right away. I told her I would help her find a way out. Give her money for a motel. Contact social services in Austin to find her a temporary place to live. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't weakness. It was my way of making a point without losing myself. She looked up, eyes full of shock. Apparently she expected me to open my arms, forget everything, and let her into my life like nothing had happened. But I couldn't. 17 years ago she'd chosen Anthony, believed his lies, built a story where I was the bad guy and he was her hope. I stood up, feeling everything shaking inside, but my voice was firm. I said it wasn't revenge. It was boundaries. I wasn't going to be her lifeline, just like she was never mine. She kicked me out because I was too strong, too independent, and Anthony was weak and needy. She wanted someone she could control, and I didn't fit that role. Now she stood in front of me, broken, and I saw in her eyes not only despair but a shadow of the same blindness. She still loved him, even after everything. I gave her $500, not out of pity, but to get her off my doorstep. Told her I'd find a place for her in a couple days, but she wouldn't live with me. She sat there, clutching the money, silent. Then she mumbled something about, "You've always been stubborn." And I almost laughed. Stubborn? Hell yeah, I'm stubborn. It was stubbornness that got me out of that Texas hole, gave me a career, a home, a life. It's stubbornness that made me who I am. While she clung to her golden boy who betrayed her. When she left, dragging her bag down the street, I closed the door and leaned my back against it. It was quiet inside, not anger, not hurt, but something new. I didn't feel guilt like I might have before. I didn't feel pity like she must have expected. I felt strength. I gave her a chance to leave with dignity, but I didn't let her into my life. It was my choice, not revenge, not forgiveness, but something in between. I stood in my house looking at the empty room and thought, I did it. I hadn't just gotten over her betrayal. I had become more than she could have imagined. The next day I called a couple of local services, found her temporary housing at a women's shelter. Sent her a text with her address, but didn't expect a response. She didn't write, she didn't call, and I wasn't surprised. Maybe she was angry, maybe she was ashamed, I didn't care. I did what I thought was right, but no more. My life, my career, my home, my rules, was still mine. I didn't have to save her from her mistakes any more than she had ever saved me from mine. A couple days later, I was sitting on the terrace with a glass of wine looking out over the rolling hills of Austin. The silence was deafening, but for the first time in a long time it was peaceful. I remembered how she'd kicked me out, how she'd chosen Anthony, how she'd believed his lies, and how I had risen from nothing, without her, without him, without their support. I became the successful, ironclad Emily, the one who doesn't break. And now that she came to me broken, I didn't slam the door in her face like she did to me. I gave her a chance to leave, but I didn't give her power over me. I thought about her, where she was now, what she was doing. Maybe she's at that shelter. Maybe she's trying to find Anthony. Maybe she's blaming me. I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't care. She'd made her choice 17 years ago, and I'd made mine now. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready to forgive her for that night, for her blindness, for her lies. But it wasn't revenge either. I didn't want to destroy her like she had tried to destroy me. It was something else, my way of saying, I am bigger than your mistakes. I sat and drank my wine and thought, is this the end of her story in my life? Or would she come back again with new requests, new lies? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. I was ready. If she knocked on my door one more time, I wouldn't flinch. I'm not the 17-year-old girl she kicked out. I'm the Iron Emily, the one who rose from the ashes and built her empire. And no one, not her, not Anthony, not their past, is going to take away what I've built. This is my story, guys. She kicked me out, called me selfish, and I became stronger than she could have dreamed. Now she asked for help, and I gave her exactly what I wanted. No more, no less. I don't know what will happen next, whether I'll ever forgive her, whether I'll ever see her again. But I do know that I'm free. And that feeling is the best thing I have.